These lawyers had the dumbest clients. The lawyer stories we've collected in this video are about clients who were so dumb they basically made their cases impossible to win. In one unforgettable story, a tenant who was trying to sue his landlord made a decision so stupid he not only blew up the case, he nearly got thrown behind bars. I was supporting the prosecution team when a defendant didn't show up in court. We couldn't get in touch with him, and even worse, he was nowhere to be found. We ended up waiting around for about 30 minutes. The judge was furious. He chewed us out and told us to get our client in line before he continued with the day's schedule. Later that day, we discovered the shocking truth. Instead of preparing for his court date, the guy had held up a 7-Eleven the night before. He was behind bars the whole time. My husband and I once worked together in a restaurant. There was this coworker who was, frankly, unpleasant and bad at her job too. One day she went to a nearby store during her break to grab some drinks. Things went downhill from there. On her errand, she tripped and broke her ankle, but there was more to the story than meets the eye. Despite her injury, she managed to drive back to work, positioned herself on the ground outside the restaurant, and began to shout for help. She even tried to stick the blame on our employer by suing them. As part of this case, we all had to clarify that she had already left the restaurant to go to the store when the mishap took place. The evidence against her then got even more insane. Things started turning when the surveillance video from the store, the place where she actually fell, was evaluated. The situation was quite dire for her by this point. To our shock, the footage showed that she couldn't resist having a drink just before her fall. But the real kicker came when another video was played. This one from the restaurant's back door, showing her limping up and positioning herself on the ground. This blatant act led to her getting fired and having her case thrown out. I've never seen karma work this fast. I once defended clients against the IRS. They were a married couple that owed nearly $250,000 in unpaid taxes. We didn't have much of an argument to make, so we decided to get the couple to meet with the IRS and ask for a little mercy. Big mistake. The wife ended up losing her temper with the IRS representative. She even stood up at one point and yelled out, "You'll pry my Mercedes from my cold, dead hands." After she stomped out of the meeting room, as you might guess, she didn't get to keep her Mercedes. My father had taken a client to court for not paying him. The judge ruled in my dad's favor for the full amount of $15,000. But the mood swiftly shifted from happy to frightening. The client he sued stood up to leave, approached my dad, and threatened him. He told my dad, "If you believe you're going to get a penny of that money, you're an idiot. I'll take you out first." Afterwards, he started to leave. For a fleeting moment, my dad worried that he might get away with his threat. But his fear was short-lived. The man had spoken loudly enough for both the court officer and the judge to hear. He didn't even step 1 foot outside of the courtroom before he had handcuffs on. And he ended up behind bars for making threats. I used to be friends with a girl who was always making the worst decisions. One time, she swiped a wallet from a gym locker room and made a beeline for Walmart. She imagined she could rack up a big shopping spree before the wallet's owner discovered it was gone. Of course, she wasn't certain if she was already too late, so she tested the waters by buying a pack of gum first. It worked. So she got bold and filled her cart with high-end items, intending to check out again. However, she didn't anticipate a major hiccup. Evidently, buying a pack of gum and then almost $5,000 worth of electronics a moment later from the same place tends to raise alerts for credit card companies. As it turned out, the card showed up as possibly stolen. She should have just given up then. The cashier told her it was flagged, so she tried to use another card from the stolen wallet. Those were flagged too, since they were all linked. She began to attract unwanted attention from the Walmart staff, which made her nervous, so she decided to use her own card. She planned to return the items later since her plan had just fallen through. That was her biggest mistake of all. Just like that, the cops had her name and address, leading to her eventual capture. When she told her lawyer her side of the story, he just put his head in his hands. I once had a client who was an elderly woman in her 70s with a serious drinking problem. Due to her husband's forgetfulness related to aging and her excessive drinking, they had some shared domestic disputes. It was a total disaster. She had been ordered to avoid any contact with him for a certain period. On top of that, she was required to stop drinking as part of her probation. Alas, she would keep drinking excessively, call her husband, and bother him, ignoring the no contact rule. After about 7 or 8 probation violations later, she was on the verge of getting time behind bars. But there was a twist. Nobody wanted to put an elderly woman behind bars, so until that point, she had received probation instead of a proper sentence. I managed to secure a no jail agreement with the prosecutor, mostly hinging on the reports that she had been attending addiction counseling successfully. The plan was for my elderly client to show up to court, plead to the charges, and finalize this agreement. That's when things went south. She did show up to court by accidentally crashing her car right in front of the courthouse because she'd been drinking with her breakfast that day. I have this friend who's a lawyer. He was in court defending a client. When it came time for the prosecution's main witness to identify the defendant, she seemed lost. My friend thought, great, if she can't point him out, they'll likely drop all charges. He was already quietly cheering, thinking he nailed this case. But then, as he let his gaze drift over to his client, he almost screamed. Unbelievably, his client had just cheerfully raised his hands to help the witness spot him. Even the judge had a good laugh at that one. I've had some experience as a lawyer for legal aid, and I've had a fair share of clients who've made questionable decisions. One memorable event involved a trial at a circuit court, located about an hour from the city where I work. My client chose to take a taxi to the courthouse, promising to pay the driver upon arrival. When they reached the town, the client asked the cab driver to stop at a convenience store near the courthouse. What happened next surprised everyone. My client tried to steal 5 26-ounce bottles of vodka without paying. They were swiftly taken in and thrown behind bars. Consequently, the trial had to be delayed, and we spent the rest of the day fruitlessly trying to secure bail for this additional offense. During a divorce case, the former husband argued that he hardly made any money and couldn't afford to pay the child support that his soon-to-be ex-wife and her legal team were asking for. I was on that team, and I knew he was lying. But we didn't have the evidence to prove it yet. It turns out we just needed to wait. A couple of hours later, he posted a snapshot on his public Facebook profile, flaunting a stack of cash and boasting about how loaded he was. Needless to say, his argument fell apart after that. When I was a law student, I volunteered at a desk that assisted people in filling out court paperwork. The difficult part was that, as I wasn't a licensed attorney, I wasn't able to give them any formal advice or let them know if they actually had a case. Even so, I heard some remarkable stories. One in particular will always stick with me. I remember a woman who wanted to sue her previous employer because they overpaid her on her last paycheck. But there was a bizarre twist. She said they overpaid her because they liked her and wanted her to come back and work for them again. Yet, she still wanted to sue them. And for an overpayment of $60, she wanted to sue them for $10,000. I didn't even know how to begin to explain to her how pointless it was. I used to be an employee at Best Buy. One of my coworkers took a customer's credit card and didn't give it back after she made a purchase. Later that day, he drove to the nearest Best Buy that wasn't ours, about 65 miles away, and used the stolen credit card to purchase a few items. He bought a TV, a surround sound system, and a PS3, all on her card. He would have gotten away with it, if not for one thing. He also used his employee discount. A few days later, he was taken in and found himself in a lot of trouble because of what he did. One of my dad's clients was initiating a lawsuit, claiming a severe leg injury from tripping in a restaurant. It seemed like a far-fetched suit, but my dad handled it well and was close to securing a good compensation for the girl. That is, until she revealed something unexpected on social media. She posted a bunch of photos on Facebook of her dancing at a bar, merely a couple of weeks post-incident. Her case was dismissed right away. I was covering a traffic case for a colleague's client at my law firm. But at the hearing, the officer didn't make it. Our client, who was accused of causing a fender bender, was completely insistent that he was innocent. I thought I had an easy one ahead of me. He was part of a 3-car pileup and swore that he was shoved into the car ahead of him by the car that hit him. I was thinking, this is a slam dunk. I turned to the client and told him, don't utter a word, okay? He nodded. We went through the hearing and all witnesses had their say. Yet, without the officer, nobody could place my client at the scene or driving the car. The judge was about to say, considering all the evidence, I must find Mr. But then my client cut him off. "Your Honor, I have some photos I took at the crash site," he interjected. I could only stare at him in disbelief. The judge responded, "Young man, did you hire a lawyer for a reason?" He nodded. "Did your lawyer ask you to speak?" He shook his head no. To that, the judge replied, "Well, before you decided to speak, nobody could place you at the accident, and I was about to dismiss your ticket. But now you've just proved you were there all by yourself." The guy quite literally talked his way into a fine. I used to work in personal injury law, representing the injured party. One memorable incident involved opposing someone else's client who was involved in a car accident. The man, an employee of the car dealership, had recklessly swerved across 2 lanes on a freeway. Then he ricocheted off a car in an intersection, finally hitting my client's car that was idle at a traffic light. My client was stuck in his car until he was extricated using the jaws of life. During the deposition, I asked the dealership employee an important question. I inquired if he had used any illicit substances on the day of the event. He denied it. I then asked about the day prior and the week before the incident. He was firm in denying any use. But some vital information I had was about to cause a stir. I presented him with the results of a drug test, required by his employer, which showed positive for multiple substances. I inquired as to why he tested positive if he claimed he hadn't taken anything. His answer was unforgettable. Startled, he exclaimed, "Well, I wouldn't have agreed to the test if I knew I would test positive." Shortly after that revelation, the case was concluded hastily in favor of my client. And there you have it. I had to appear in court over a ticket. And I had a wild stroke of luck. The officer misplaced the ticket book, so there wasn't any official proof. The judge told the next 15 people on the docket, including me, that we only had to say "not guilty," seeing as there was no evidence. One guy got up, and he didn't realize what was happening. He started to argue that he was only going 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, not 10. The judge glanced at him and said, "Son, just say not guilty." The man again objected, "But I wasn't going that fast." The judge chuckled and reminded him again, "Son, I only need 2 words from you, not and guilty." The man, looking puzzled, uttered, "Not guilty?" As if questioning. The judge said, "Case dismissed." The entire courtroom broke into laughter and applause for him. I was studying law and helping out lawyers with different cases. One time, we found ourselves in the middle of a squabble about the care of an elderly lady. She was suffering from dementia and was quite old, so her daughter and a lawyer were named as her official guardians. But the niece, who was our client, raised doubts about the daughter's intentions. The daughter's behavior was definitely suspicious. She had taken tons of money from her mom, not to mention a vacuum cleaner and even her silverware. As a result, the poor old lady was left with no choice but to eat with her hands. It seemed like an open and shut case for us. Then our client, the niece, moved the old lady to a nursing home to assure she'd get proper care. There was just one problem. She did this without consulting us. Even though she meant well, the daughter and the lawyer were still the elderly woman's guardians. They were the ones who had the right to decide where she lived. In the end, things took a turn for the worse. They accused our client of abduction and we lost the case. I used to work as a defense lawyer in New York City, and in the city's lockup, every call made by prisoners was taped. I'd often tell my clients that their calls weren't private and to avoid talking about their case or calling anyone involved in it. I had one client who was up on charges of bothering and threatening his ex-girlfriend. This was my first and last encounter with a genuine case of double jeopardy. My client had already admitted his guilt and served a short sentence for the same offense. So, on our first court appearance, I was certain that my client would walk out a free man. But boy, was I in for a shock. When we got there, I learned that there was another indictment against my client for new transgression. This happened because the genius that my client was, he had phoned his ex while inside, and the prosecutor had tapes of him threatening to harm her if she showed up in court to give evidence against him. Unfortunately, this meant only one thing. We had no choice but to enter a guilty plea on the spot. He got sentenced for 3 years for interfering with a witness and contempt of court. If only my client had paid heed to my advice and let me do the work. He could have been a free man 3 years earlier. Unbelievable. A guy I went to high school with ended up in a difficult situation. After serving time in lockup, he was released on probation. Struggling to find a job to cover his probation and court fees, he made a pretty major mistake. He chose to hold up a bank, Casually, he walked into the bank and slipped a note to the teller saying he was holding up the place and demanded money. Surprisingly, she complied and he left. Bizarrely, the moment he walked out, she flipped over the note. Rather shockingly, the paper he used was actually the rear side of his probation form, complete with his address and all his details. You can guess what happened next, right? He was back in custody quite quickly after that. I once had a client who was accused of multiple counts of possession with intent to sell. This wasn't his first run-in with these charges, and the consequences were dire. He was facing a minimum of 10 years behind bars if found guilty. The state offered a plea deal that would set aside the mandatory sentence. It seemed like a pretty straightforward decision. The plea deal implied a 12-year sentence with possibility of parole in 3 to 4 years. But he didn't want to take it. Insistent on his innocence, the client, who was out on bail, rejected the offer. On the day of his trial, my client was nowhere to be found. I alerted the judge and prosecutor that he might not show up. As I left the court, a deputy gave me the news. My client was behind bars. I rushed over to speak to him. He had been picked up for driving after drinking on the eve of his trial, and the officer discovered 15 packets of illicit substances hidden in his shoe. Despite this, he insisted that the stash was not his. Unfortunately, he was convicted of 2 counts of possession with intent to distribute at his trial, and this time, he really had to pay the price. He got a 21-year sentence with a compulsory 10-year term that wasn't eligible for parole or suspension. On top of that, he was found guilty of another possession with intent charge related to the stuff in his shoe. This resulted in an added 25-year mandatory sentence to be served consecutively with his previous sentence. Still, he had stuck to his story. The stuff wasn't his. It's hard to believe. One of my friends was married to this shady guy who happened to have an equally shady friend. This not so bright friend got himself taken in because he decided to hold up his own local bank. And that's not the funniest part. Even while wearing a ski mask, a bank teller recognized him from his regular visits and reported him to the authorities. So he ended up behind bars. Then an unexpected surprise came knocking on my friend's door early one morning. The police were searching for a small garden of plants she had grown in her backyard that weren't exactly legal. When she asked how they knew, they told her that the friend had written her and her husband a letter from behind bars, and its contents were unbelievable. It read, "How are you? I'm good. How's your garden going? I can't wait to be released so we can enjoy some. The supply here isn't reliable, so I hope you're taking extra care of our plants. Haha. Please say hello to everybody for me." He signed it. But there was something he didn't realize. All mail from there is monitored, so the censors got wind of it and tipped off the authorities. Consequently, my friend and her less than perfect husband got caught and put behind bars for growing an intent to sell. Her lawyer advised the client to dress up nicely for court, implying she would wear her Sunday best. But when she arrived, everybody in the room inhaled sharply. She strutted in wearing a matching sweatsuit with the word "juicy" brilliantly displayed on the backside. Then things got even worse. As potential jurors started to enter, she asked how long the whole thing would take, mentioning that she'd left her baby in her car, which was parked nearby with the hazard lights on. My friend Chuck, who's not always the smartest, came home from university one weekend and attended a party at my place. That's when disaster struck. This girl that I didn't really know accused him of hitting her, and she and her friend reported it to the police the following day. I was asked to provide a witness statement, despite not having seen anything. We had a shared acquaintance whose dad was a lawyer. This lawyer advised us not to respond and to ignore the charges. Chuck headed back to school the next day, and no more was said about it. I always thought that it seemed like a weird choice, to ignore a pressing legal matter, but eventually I forgot about it. However, 3 years later, things took a turn. Chuck was visiting home again when the authorities ran his license plate one evening as he was leaving my house. 4 officers showed up at his place the following day with a warrant for the old charges. Chuck was so engrossed in a video game that he didn't notice the officers dealing with a neighbor's escaped pit bull. Finally, they came banging on his door. Once he discovered what was going on, he contacted the lawyer and they started making arrangements for his court appearance. During this time, I happened to be dating the friend of the supposed victim. That's when the entire story was revealed. She admitted to the lawyer that her friend had made up the story. Chuck and his lawyer went to court, and the judges agreed that there was no proof that Chuck really hurt the girl intentionally. Just when we thought the case was over, all hell broke loose. The girl's father got into a fight with Chuck outside the courthouse. Chuck inadvertently knocked into the prosecutor. He got charged with assaulting an officer of the court, less than 10 minutes after having his previous charge dropped. I was doing a mediation between a landlord and a renter where the renter slowly came around to the landlord's side. He was like, "You know what? It's not a big deal. Let's give her what she wants." I was surprised he relented. And then I made a chilling realization. As I was wrapping up the discussion, I noticed him furtively clutching what appeared to be a joint. He was strategically positioned near an air vent, which might have explained the odd smell I couldn't quite identify earlier. When I looked down the hallway, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were so many cops continually passing by. We were just a stone's throw from the courtroom door. As he walked off, it dawned on me that he might have been too high to truly consent to this agreement, something he likely regretted come morning. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.